So I think when people study, or the body of work that exists on infant and children's early understanding of social behavior and social affiliation focuses on sort of two main groups of social behaviors. One set I'll sort of group together as work on how infants connect affiliation to shared behavior norms, as Moritz was just talking about, similarity amongst individuals or alignment amongst their actions, sort of imitation. And the second is how infants and children think about pro and antisocial behavior, how they evaluate individuals who engage in those behaviors, and how they connect them to the relationships between individuals. And there's, one approach to thinking about these two broad groups of behaviors is just to treat them as sort of two separate types of social behavior that infants are thinking about. Sort of two, as we'll talk about later, sort of two domains within the social area that are somewhat separate from one another. One focused on maybe group cognition, and the other focused on moral cognition. But instead, I'd like to propose that there might be a common reason why these two sets of behaviors are linked with social affiliation. And to set up that common reason, I'm going to play a quick video of that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, of a scenario in which a toddler engages in some prosocial behavior. So here, the experimenter drops the clothespin on the floor. He's reaching out to try to grab it, and the baby comes and picks it up and hands it back. Right. So there's an example of a prosocial behavior. Okay, and so we'll refer to the person in need here as agent A, and the individual who's doing the helping as agent B. And in work by Tomer Ullman and Kiley, Hamlin and colleagues on sort of how to formalize thinking about these kinds of behaviors or recognizing them when they occur, and whether or not that formalization fits with infants' understanding of helping, you can think of helping as a case where agent B adopts agent A's goal or reward function, right? So what agent A wants out of the world is to have that clothespin off the floor. Agent B's sort of natural desire might be to just hang out on the carpet, like, playing with those red strings or whatever the baby's doing. But if agent B decides to help agent A, then he's going to adopt that goal of having the clothespin off the floor and in agent A's hand. And that's how we might sort of think of or define helping. Cooperation might be similarly defined as sort of agent B deciding to initiate a joint goal with agent A. And so I'm going to propose that we could think of affiliation, or maybe a core component of infants' early concept of affiliation is a stable probability that agent B will adopt agent A's goals or reward functions. So just how likely across time and across situations is agent B to want to help or cooperate with agent A is maybe a way that we could think about an early concept of affiliation. And while there might be some situations in which agent A actually has an unmet goal and they need help, there might be also a lot of cases in which goal or reward adoption might occur without agent A actually having an unmet goal. So this would be like imitation or alignment, right? So say that instead of having dropped the clothespin, agent A had just been sort of clipping clothespins onto a line. Agent B might have adopted that same goal and come along and joined in that activity. And similarly, when we think about different kinds of basic mimicry or imitation that people engage in, it might sort of reflect this same adoption by agent B of agent A's goals or utility. So if affiliation
sorry, Lindsey, there is a builder box over your slides that is hiding them from us.
Ah, what's that? A what box?
Some kind of it's a gray box. It's written build order, no build effects.
Ah, I see. This animation thing is up. Is that, let's see, is this better?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, so helping agent B adopts agent A's goals. Affiliation is this sort of general stable probability that agent B will do that for agent A. And this could occur even without there being an unmet goal. So that's the way in which this sort of concept of affiliation might explain a link to both helping, but also broader shared behaviors or similarity between individuals. Okay, so a simple, this sort of definition of affiliation is, in its most simple case, asymmetrical, right? It's about agent B adopting agent A's utility, doesn't necessarily say anything about the reverse occurring. And there is a really simple asymmetrical case of this kind of affiliation that really matters to infants, which is caregiving, right? So caregivers typically are reaching out and helping infants with the things that they need and want in the world, whereas infants are not necessarily doing the same for caregivers. So to Moritz's point about thinking about, what's the role or importance of the various concepts that infants might be developing about affiliation and shared behavior, it's going to be really important for them to understand the potential for these asymmetrical relationships to exist because they're seeking out caregiving in the world around them. So it might not be surprising then that infants seem to reason much better about the agents who are engaging in the helping behavior or the imitating behavior than agents who are the recipients. Got it, thanks. So for example, infants prefer helpers in Kiley's work before they begin to expect protagonists to do the same. In my own work, I find that when infants are exposed to the purple individual there who has an imitative interaction with one individual but not the other, they're much faster to reason about how the imitator or non-imitator's feelings toward that lead character than the reverse. So I'm going to propose that they start out with this sort of asymmetrical concept of affiliation that's helping them to connect who people are likely to help and also who they're likely to act like. And that this might act as a scaffold for future development. So for example, it might lead them to go on and look for or observe examples where these kinds of affiliative relationships are symmetrical, or even use groups or categories as predictors of where these relationships are going to exist, right? So as Moritz talks about, there's going to be some statistical learning here where they might notice that when there's an affiliative relationship in one direction, there's often one in the other. And that might be a way that they sort of develop an understanding of groups. And I'll give some credit there to sort of Dave Petraszewski's theory of coalition understanding. And it might also be the case that when they pay attention to what behaviors tend to be shared, they come to have an understanding of which behaviors are most likely to go along with affiliation. So things like speaking the same language, eating the same foods, performing the same sort of conventional behaviors. And that might be sort of an impetus for that kind of statistical learning. All right, and I am done.
Okay, hello, now it's my turn. I'm gonna share the screen also, like Lindsey. Do you see my screen? Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer of this conference because every year is an amazing conference, and this year, despite the fact that it's virtual, it's still being an amazing conference. And of course, thanks the organizer of this discussion session, and I'm very happy to be participating next to the other panelists. So the discussion today is about how and why do infants develop an understanding of social behaviors. And I'm gonna focus more in the how, with the general claim that the understanding of several social behaviors start with the understanding of the other agent actions and goals beyond the fact that if these actions are or not social. And then later, when we realize how the action of one individual influence the action of other individual, is when we represent these actions as social. And the stability of this social interaction is what leads to representation of social relationships. And I'm going to exemplify this with some examples. Okay, so first I'm going to start with the competition cooperation case. In the competition, what we have usually is more than one individual, let's say two, who have a common goal: to move this object from the center of the screen to one side of the screen. The main characteristic of the competition is that the actions performed by one of the agents to achieve his goal prevent the other agent goal achievement. In the case of cooperation, the components are pretty similar. We have two individuals. We have a common goal, that is move this object from the center of the screen to the other side. But this time, the action of the agents are aligned. So the actions performed by one of the agents increase the probability of success of the other. So then here, the first step is to represent the agents, their goals, and their action. And because the action of one agent influences the action of the other is why we consider this as a social action. And this the stability of this interaction lead to the representation of social dominance or social partnership in the second case. Now, let me introduce another example that I think that is a bit more opaque. That is the case of the social imitation. That, as Lindsey said, usually is considered a cue of the representation of other social groups or affiliation. And I think that here the action understanding also play a crucial role, especially in the case of the imitation of irrational behaviors. And let me extend on this. Imagine that you have you observe one individual who have the goal to go from one side of the screen to the other and touch this block, and he takes the more efficient path. So here everyone understands the agent, the goal, and the action. And you have a second agent who have the same goal and perform the same task. Here, because the action of the agents can be accounted by the principle of rationality, you don't necessarily assume that there is any kind of imitation, and you don't infer any kind of social relationships. But it's different when the imitation is the imitation of irrational action. Imagine again one individual, the goal, and the individual takes a tortuous, inefficient path. So now you observe a second individual with the same goal and perform exactly the same action. So here, theoretically, the probability of one agent performing an inefficient action is theoretically low. So imagine two individuals performing exactly the same irrational action. And if we see this several times, so one agent performing an irrational action, another agent performing the same irrational action, and these actions cannot be accounted by the principle of rationality in this case, we start to represent or we realize that the actions performed by one of the agents is influencing the action of the other one. And the stability of this influence leads us to the representation of the relationships. An affiliative are even an asymmetrical social relationship. And here I don't want to enter in which kind of how we label this kind of relationship, but focus on the idea that here again, first we represented the agents, their goal, their action, and because they broke the principle of rationality, we have been able to represent the social interaction and the social relationship. So that's all. Thank you all for your attention. I expect a fruitful discussion.
And our next speaker is Kiley.
Thank you, whoever unmuted me. Okay, thank you to Lindsey for organizing, and to the organizers. This has really been wonderful. I've never been able to participate before, given our school calendar, so I'm excited to be able to be here virtually. Okay, so the question that I want to ask is sort of, I hope, follows up well on some of the presentations we've seen. But starts with the observation that there's been an explosion of research into infants' capacities for representing social interactions within their first year. And indeed, as Lindsey pointed out, these seem to occur within at least two broad sort of domains, and likely others, but I haven't focused on those here. One is sort of sensitivity to prosocial and antisocial behavior, things like helping and hindering, aggression versus protection and comfort, fairness and unfairness, and then also sensitivity to things that may or may not be cues to group membership. So individuals acting alike in movements or speech, having shared preferences, looking alike. And also to point out, each of these domains appears to support both action expectation on the part of the infant, but also selective affiliation. So they both seem to understand actions that fall under these categories, and then also use those actions as the basis to evaluate others. So the question then becomes, what is going on here? Is this tendency to understand and evaluate the social world based on one single or sort of unitary cognitive system, or are there two or potentially many more interacting systems that are leading to these findings? And rather than come down on a particular answer, I just want to sort of talk about what might be the case if it's one system versus more. So if it's one system, what might be its basic building block or blocks? For example, can we derive all of the complexities that we observe in infants from some add-on to a basic concept of rational agency that agents have and pursue goals? For example, perhaps infants can detect when two or more agents' goals are or are not aligned. Cases in which they're aligned might be helping or might be imitating, as Lindsey beautifully pointed out, and cases where they're not aligned might be hindering, or I use innovating as sort of the opposite of imitating. And potentially what infants are doing is they're detecting goal alignment or not at both dyadic between two agents and multi-party or sort of group level interactions. And again, I think Lindsey proposed this, and Jesús's proposal might be a variant of this as well. On the other hand, I just want to raise the possibility that maybe instead what we need to posit is multiple systems that interact in some cases but are not themselves based on the same building block. Some evidence that it may be multiple systems is that I'm not sure how any simple goal alignment theory can explain understanding or evaluating fair and unfair distributions. Potentially we could work something out there, but it's not intuitively obvious to me how that would work. Nor instances where infants prefer or sort of adjust their expectations for those who don't align with others' goals, but instead hinder them. And we've seen a number of cases in which infants think it's only good to adopt certain others' goals and are capable of positively evaluating those who fail to align with others in certain cases. And finally, I just want to point out that when I think about this, I think about if it's one system, then probably the marked case should be the same across all of these different potential domains. And I think there's some hints that the marked case is not the same in the prosocial antisocial domain and the group domain. So for example, in the prosocial antisocial domain, antisocial seems to be marked. So there's literature out there and some hints in other papers as well that infants are focused on hindering, at least at first in the prosocial antisocial domain. So they distinguish and expect others to distinguish hindering from neutral, but not helping from neutral, at least at the same ages. Whereas in the group domain, it seems like in-group is the thing that's marked. So for example, they have expectations for in-group positivity rather than out-group negativity. So sort of no expectations for out-group negativity. Another variant of this is that they seem to expect in-group support, but be rather agnostic for what happens between out-group members. So together, I think these pieces of evidence and potentially others suggest that it's not immediately clear that it's all one system, and sort of we should continue to sort of, sorry, I thought I had one more slide here, but my computer's telling me I don't. We should continue to pursue this question as to whether it's a unitary cognitive system, and if so, what the basic building blocks are, versus two or more, potentially more interacting systems, and determine what the basics are within each. Okay, thank you very much.
So let me thank our panelists for really great introductions, and you can already see that we are already moving into the discussion with Kiley's presentation. Before we do that, I should say that this session is recorded, so just so you know, but we had to make this explicit. And we have one clarification from Gergely Chibra.
Yes. So this is for Lindsey, because I just want to make sure that you understand what she claims here when she talks about the primacy of these asymmetric relations compared to the symmetric ones. So one way to understand is that infants are attuned to certain asymmetric relationships because of their special status, because they are small compared to parents or other kind of relations. And then they build on these different relations, and then eventually they come up with a concept of affiliation, which encompasses all of these. The other way, and I think this is what you suggested, the second one, that they have an idea of affiliation concept, and just happen to be the case that they recognize more the asymmetric cases, but all of these actually go into directly into the same bucket of affiliation. So which one is your point?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm making an attempt to be minimally nativist here and posit as little initial conceptual structure as I can. And so it seems to me like, yes, there's something of a coincidence between the fact that if the way you're representing affiliation is just the likelihood that one individual will adopt another's goals and rewards, et cetera, that also lines up with caregiving relationships, right? That seems like an extremely simple way to track affiliation. It also happens to line up with caregiving. And so I think that, it could be the case that infants have a special tendency to represent those relationships because they're so important to them. But it could also just be the case that that's a really easy way to track affiliation, that it becomes a building block for expecting you generate an over hypothesis that when one individual, when A is affiliated with B, B also tends to be affiliated with A, or the particular kinds of markers that are group markers, indicate sort of joint affiliation across all group members. But that you can get away with a really simple basic block, which is just when I see evidence that one individual tends to adopt the goals and rewards of another individual, I'm going to posit this, unidirectional affiliative bond where that person is going to, I'm going to predict that they'll continue to do that in the future. So yeah, I think I'm going with your type B here, where I'm arguing that there's just a single representation of affiliation happens to capture what's most important to infants, and you can build the other things out of it. And that, you could find evidence for more complex or directed types of representations. For example, maybe they're better at representing these things when there's a big versus a small, a big helper versus a small recipient. But maybe it's just a simple, straightforward building block.
We have another clarification question. Let me say that we should restrict ourselves to genuine clarification questions, and you can ask more substantive questions afterwards. But so Yuri had a question. Let me unmute you.
Thank you, but then I withdraw.
Okay. So there will be plenty of opportunities to ask substantive questions. Okay, perfect. So, and now following up on Kiley's question, we can start the discussion part of the session. And so Kiley raised a number of questions about the domain specificity and the unity of the mechanisms that may be used to represent affiliation and to conceive of social relations in general. And so I would like to have the reactions of the other members of the panel. So Moritz, Lindsey, and Jesús, if you can react to this, and perhaps one important aspect that she highlighted, and I think it's a common thread between your presentations, about the role of indeed the representation of individual actions understood as the actions of rational agents as a way to form a unified representation of social behaviors, social interactions, social relationships. So maybe, Moritz, do you want to start?
Yeah, just a brief comment on this. So, yeah, what I think that former modular theories actually came from was the idea that there are modules in the brain. So one way to tackle this question more generally, maybe what we know now better about how the brain structures and what structured, and also what basic learning mechanisms we have there. Just to relate it to one of our topics, namely predictive processing, one may say that, okay, to affiliate with others, it's really crucial that others behave predictable, so that unitary mechanisms in terms of I need to form better predictions of the other to align with the other may play a crucial role in both. But of course, on the other hand side, we know that affiliation may be more based on endocrine system and process going on there, and on the one hand side, and then social representations are more may have more to do with specific regions in the brain where agency is encoded. And there, just one idea how we may tackle this question in future is try to find links between what is really actually happening in the neural bedrock of our cognition, so to say, in our brain, and what we may learn from those processes. For example, the interaction between the endocrine system and specific insights we have from brain regions. For example, what we've heard in our first plenary on this conference, to try to better understand what is what should we assume of what specific building blocks are there, and how they may interact, and how they be connected in the sense of a connectome that is then really the basis for our cognition.
Does anyone wants to react to that, or to add to the question of unity and domain specificity of representations of affiliation?
Yeah, me. I think that. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So following the comment of of Moritz, that studying the brain maybe can help us to identify or clarify this kind of question, with adults, with theoretically already know, there are recent studies showing that the brain areas focused on the representation of actions and brain areas that are more reactive to the interaction of this action. So I agree that the study of the brain areas can help us, and of course, even if there is a domain-specific system to represent the social, this system rely on other mechanisms. For example, the action understanding, that I think that all the speakers here agree. This is the first comment. Second, there is a question that I think that is what raised Kiley in his talk, is that if there are different domains to represent different kind of social relationships. And here I would like to say that there are many types of social relationships, but most of them have common factors, even when they are not apparently the same. For example, is the case of the social imitation or leader-follower relationship, that is an asymmetrical relationship, and the case of dominance-subordinate, that again is asymmetrical. So both relations are asymmetrical, but in both cases, the alignment of the actions are not the same. Or when we have cooperation and helping, in both cases, the actions are aligned, but in one case, the goal is for the two agents, and in the other case, no. So then I think that future studies or maybe future theoretical work can try to determine what are the components that describe the different kind of social interaction and social relationship. Because when we know this, maybe we can start to design the experiments using, for example, fMRI techniques with the infant.
Can I just kick into just briefly add to this? So I think just what we have to be cautious about is that when we find that one brain area is rather specialized for one thing and another brain area for another thing, that we should not confuse it with like clear evidence for modular theory, for example. And I do not think that you meant this, but this could be understood as it. So just because we know that there are, it is just really the connectome and the close interactions between all brain areas, and that also we have a huge plasticity, and there we can also learn from neuroscience that, for example, in deaf people, the area that is usually used to encode language may be used to encode symbols. So just to clarify that, and that we are not sliding into this, okay, we have modules in the brain.
So do any of Lindsey, maybe you want to add something?
Well, I mean, and I really appreciate that discussion, and I think Moritz and Jesús raised some great points. But to bring it back to Kiley's proposals about the kinds of evidence that would tell us whether or not there are multiple social domains versus more of a unitary one, I do think you need something beyond an understanding of agents and when individuals do and don't share goals. But I'm just not sure it's a domain of cognition. So I think a lot of the examples she brought up were like sort of cases where infants have particular preferences based on patterns of pro or antisocial behavior that can't necessarily be easily explained by just this sort of tracking of who shares utility. Like, so for example, preferring hinderers when they're hindering someone who previously was a hinderer themselves, right? And also, well, yeah, I'll start with that case to begin with. So I do think you need something else in sort of like that sort of intersects with this domain of infants' judgment of who's a worthy individual. But I wonder if it comes not from sort of moral concepts about goodness and badness, but from a sense of, so once infants start get into this game themselves of developing their own affiliations, they're going to be potentially adopting others' goals themselves, right? So I for example, think of the work of Robert Hepak and Emmersche Weisch, where they show that infants sort of have this desire for needy individuals to have their goals fulfilled, particularly when they have no reason to sort of dislike those individuals. And so one way to explain a basic preference for helpers when infants are third-party observers is that they want to see those goals fulfilled themselves, right? Like they have in some sense adopted the goal of the needy individual. And so now the helper is sort of aligned not only with the needy individual, but with the infant themselves. And in cases where they decide not to do that, like for example, when they think that the needy individual isn't worthy of them themselves wanting to sort of help, then their sort of preference for the helper might be abated, or they might prefer someone who's hindering if they really, sort of have adopted the stance of wanting the bad individual to not get what they want. So I guess I do think there needs to be some sort of motivational factor to sort of that intersects with how people have behaved in the past in terms of who infants want to see helped or not. But I'm not sure it needs to be its own separate cognitive system for representing something like moral worth. If that, I'm not sure if that's getting at sort of the point Kiley was trying to make, but that's how I would respond to sort of that proposal about that being evidence for multiple systems rather than a single one.
Maybe Kiley, if you have something to reply to this.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that analysis is right. I brought that case up as one of a sort of larger pattern of results that make me concerned that the alignment case just, and obviously I'm very prone to liking the alignment case. I've argued it myself. So it's not that I don't think that gets us quite far. I just am not sure that it gets us all the way. And I think we need to carefully consider whether or not it does. So, another example that keeps coming back is, this evidence that infants understand sort of fair and unfair or equal and unequal distributions, in the first 6 months. And, that's a really abstract kind of goal that sort of one individual wants to have the same things as other individuals. And I don't know what purchase a very young infant would get on that kind of situation based on this goal alignment. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right to bring up the hinderers case as probably my weakest bit of counter evidence. But I just try to consider every case and think what would this goal alignment possibility tell us? Again, I think it gets us really far in helping and hindering, and I love the symmetry with the sort of preference for imitators, as sort of you can adopt others' general sort of goals, but those are about actions and sort of observables, whereas this sense of like one individual should get the same amount as another individual, that is much less observable, and so I think there's less purchase there. So yeah, thanks.
I think we should transition to our second topic, and actually we are already moving into this territory, so which is about infants' social preferences. So of course, infants are not just dispassionate observers of their social environment, and they have to engage into relations and interactions with others. And so there is a general question about the kinds of mechanisms they may use to form certain preferences for specific kind of agents, and how at a more reflective level they may represent social preferences in others. So that's a very general way to formulate the question. There is a bit of a more specific way to formulate the question given our very nice lineup of speakers, which is that indeed in a set of several seminal studies, Kiley has found that preverbal infants prefer to reach and orient towards helpers over hinderers. And it's a result that she interpreted in terms of moral cognition. So very quickly put, a preference for good guys over bad guys, but you will have lots of time to correct me if I'm too caricatural in this description. What is interesting here is that Lindsey is providing an alternative interpretation of this phenomenon in terms of preference for agents who have a propensity to adopt another agent's utility function. And I believe that Moritz's view, where normative reasoning should develop very early, may also cast some light on those results, as well as Jesús' views, who has emphasized the role of the interpretability of agents' behavior in shaping infants' social preferences. So I want to know what you think about, again, the motivational basis for infants' social preferences, and how you see well, these different accounts. That's the very general question, and the more specific question is about how you see these respective accounts of helping versus hindering, preference for helpers, how you see them related, and how you think you could disentangle them. Perhaps we could start with Lindsey, I don't know, since you already introduced this topic in your presentation.
Sure. Yeah. Right. So, So I argued that that infants might link affiliation to both sort of imitation or shared behavior, and helping via this idea that what affiliation is sort of sharing utility functions or reward functions. But I think then there's this second step of a question of like, well, so why do infants end up, if they're the third party observer in this situation, why do they end up with a preference for any individuals? And in the last response to Kiley, I think I talked about sort of like one half of what this answer might be, which is that when infants themselves and young children have a lot of prosocial motivation, and so when they're motivated to help or be involved or adopt utility, then they might share in common those goals with the helpers, and thus end up feeling affiliated with them to some extent. But I think there's this other question, right, of like, who's going to be a good social partner for me, right? And also obviously at some point in the developmental trajectory that we develop a sense of who was good, we do develop a moral sense. And so at some point that there's going to be also this preference for individuals who've acted morally. But on the who's a good social partner for me note, I think one thing that might be key here is, and I was just trying to look up the first author on this work. I really am sorry that I've forgotten who it is. The senior authors are Katie Kinsler and Kristen Schutz. I think maybe Jocelyn Dautel might be the first author, but it's work showing that as kids get older, they develop stronger expectations of parochialism. And that maybe one thing that would characterize an early interpretation of other social behavior is that the way people behave is the way that they're going to behave toward me too. Right. And so it's not till kids are older and develop this sort of expectation that behavior is mainly directed toward, that the way someone's behaving is mainly directed toward their friends and isn't going to apply to me, that they start to be more cautious in their judgments based on third-party observations. So when they see someone imitating someone else, they might think, oh, this person generally is like, you know, is open to alignment and affiliation. Maybe they'll do that with me. When they see someone being helpful, it's the same. And so one thing I have, one sort of little bit of data that I'll be presenting at SRCD that we've asked is whether third-party preferences for imitators decline as older kids' expectations of parochialism increase. And we found a little bit of evidence to that effect, that when kids expect that like a girl who could share her cookies with both a friend and a stranger chooses, you know, as they start to expect that instead she'll only share with a friend and not also with a stranger, they also sort of decrease in these third-party preferences based on social behavior. So that's the one other thing I'd say beyond. Infants are going to have their own pro-social motivations that are going to help them sort of develop these social preferences. They also may sort of be relying on these behavioral interactions they witness being good cues to how someone would act toward them as well.
Moritz, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, maybe to add one consideration from the debate in early pro-social development here. I think what we also should have in mind when we think about shared utility functions, and I also like this idea a lot, is that aligning with the other goal or the other perspective or utility function may also come with a motivational or an emotional component. There is the debate, for example, in pro-social behavior, then that just as Lindsey explained, that okay, I align with the goal of the other, and then it is easy for me to feel also the concern. So basically, by putting myself into the shoe of the other, this does not only come with the cognitive understanding of the goal, but possibly also with the motivational component that empathetic concern comes with, so that I can actually, through the perspective of the other, feel what the other would like to have. And this goes a little bit into the direction, I think, also of Barisi and Moore, who proposed this, I think, in the late in the late 90s, that okay, this may be a basic principle how we really come to understand also the perspective of others, that we begin to in a shared action context understand that the other may have a similar perspective as I do. But of course, we are talking about a bit of an earlier age here, and there we may also learn from empathetic concern that really what comes with understanding what the other wants, also the emotional and motivational component that then motivates me to help or do something shared with the other.
Okay, Jesús, please go ahead. And let me add before Jesús intervenes that, of course, the floor is open for questions and comments. So don't be shy. This is a conversation with the entire room, not just the panelists.
Okay. So I think one thing that we are missing here now is that, okay, we are talking about the preference for the helpers, for the imitators, and I think that Lindsey's proposed a framework that match both cases with the preference for someone who is likely to share the utility of others. But there is other cases that we know that infants have preference. For example, the case of the preference for the in-group members, or for example, the preference for rational actors, etc. So I would like to suggest maybe a more low-level interpretation of all of this preference. That is the case of the interpretability. So that actually infants prefer those individuals that they can understand or predict their behaviors. And for example, in the case of the imitators, they know how these individuals act because they know how the target of imitation is acting. In the case of the rationality, they understand the rational actor. In the case of the in-group members, they expect that they behave similarly. So maybe this explanation, it's more easier than not to expect that infants think about the motivational factors of prefer the helper because in the future maybe the helper is going to help him, or because other more elaborated inference.
Jesús, I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure it fits with all of the data. So basically, infants prefer those that they can interpret their behaviors. You might expect a consistent pattern of attention to different sorts of behaviors and preferences. And I think that across many studies, we don't see that. So for example, we don't find sort of baseline attentional differences to helping versus hindering, and yet we find preferences. In other cases, you might find the expectations and not the preferences. So I think in order to talk about interpretability, that's a sort of cognitive sort of assessment of the actions themselves. And we would expect a sort of more direct link between preferences and expectations if that were the case. But maybe the evidence is there and we just haven't observed it consistently yet. So I'm not saying that that's not right. I just think it's not immediately obvious that it is, given this link isn't there.
I see we have a set of questions from the audience. And first is Denis Taton, whom I will unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question to this interpretability account. I think there is a piece of literature that doesn't quite fit with it, despite I really like the ambitiousness of this. And this is Ashley Thomas results on preferences for dominance or in younger infants for yielders. From an interpretability account, also especially if you assume that agents, goal-directed agents may be more attentionally salient, I would in fact assume the opposite, that a younger infants would more readily understand an agent that seizes an object over an agent that performs an otherwise intransitive action that doesn't produce any salient change of effect, like just bowing. So how would you, this is obviously more directed to Jesús, how would you explain those findings in light of the account you proposed?
Okay, so I have to say that when I was thinking in this alternative hypothesis, I have problems to fit it in the case of dominant subordinate interaction. So, and first of all, I would like to say that there is not as much evidence for the preference for dominant agents that there is, for example, for helpers. So that's the first thing. So first, we need more data about this. And second, so here the thing is, which action is more predictable, the action of the dominant or the action of the subordinate? And I think that dominant individuals are dominant over many other individuals, but subordinates usually are subordinates just for one dominant. So if we assume that hierarchical relationships are in a pyramid shape, so then I think that it's easier to expect the dominant to prevail. Okay, because the resource of Ashley is for the yeah. So I don't know.
But it's a fair point that the literature indeed is very exiguous on this topic.
Yeah.
That the broad scope, obviously, these results also challenge a Lindsey account because they're not based on any type of mimesis of the goal, given that the goal is indeed an anti-symmetric goal. Unless I'm not, Lindsey, do you have an explanation of this that I'm not able to?
I don't think there needs to be mimesis or mimicry involved for infants to understand when one individual has adopted the other one's reward function. So actually Tomer Ullman's original models of how this works, right? The helpers could do things like move rocks out of the way of a path. They didn't have to be like pushing the individual along the trajectory they wanted to go along. So to the extent that our inverse planning capacities let us understand helping behaviors that aren't directly mirroring the protagonist, I think then, that opens up the ability to understand all kinds of behaviors as having adopted the utility function of the other individual.
So to paraphrase, in Ashley's case, this would amount to understanding that the subordinate is somebody who's, by not acting, letting the dominant seize the object, all right? Okay.
Yeah. So and then it's interesting that that's the initial preference, right? And that it's not till later when potentially maybe infants are doing or toddlers are doing a better job of reasoning about like, oh, what might I get out of being affiliated with this dominant individual that I couldn't get out of being affiliated with someone who just has the initial instinct of adopting everyone else's goals that might be advantageous. So yeah, I feel like this account works well with Ashley's pattern of findings.
We had a question from Gerge.
Yeah, this is another clarification question, just to understand because I'm not sure whether everyone has the same idea of what preferences mean here, right? So the preferences could express lots of different things, just liking, affiliation, partner choice, empathy that Moritz mentioned, so the question is whether we can just lump these together, that these are just some kind of positive evaluation without any deeper meaning, or should we discriminate among these kind of functions of preference?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm happy to let others answer, but I'll just quickly say, I don't think that the behavioral measures that we use to determine preference, like looking and reaching, are unitary measures that are picking out a single type of preference that's just shallow and just means I'm attracted to this. I think there's all kinds of reasons infants look more at an individual, all kinds of reasons they reach more toward things, right? Like in addition to what you mentioned, there's also exploratory motives based on information seeking, right? So I think our behavioral tools are not very helpful here.
Maybe just to, sorry, you go ahead, Kiley.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think understanding what the basis of the preference is sort of really critical to understanding the mechanism, of course. So one thing that we've been trying to do for many years and just come up short is two different things. First, showing that infants care about competent versus incompetent others. And as a sort of sense of, do they just like those who get goals done? And we have found a sort of just host of negative evidence that they do. So it seems that when someone's goal is in service of someone else's goal, they show preferences, but when someone's just good at getting things done, they don't. In another line of research, we've tried to find evidence that independently of goal contexts, infants prefer those who make others happy and disprefer those who make others sad. And again, we don't find evidence that they do this independently of goal-directed action. So my bias currently is thinking that it is something important about goal-directedness and sort of adopting others' goals, at least in this context of the sort of helping and hindering and potentially imitation context, because we just have not been able to observe general preferences at the same ages for those who are just good at stuff in general, as well as preferences for those who make others display positive emotion.
I think it's indeed an interesting approach to this problem, to think, okay, is it possibly just tagging a person with a more positive attitude or a negative attitude? For example, in the standard paradigm by Kiley, it's also the case that the infant is observing the helper in a positive interaction with the other, so that this social evaluation may then be a halo effect for partner choice or alike. But I also think that I just have it in mind that I saw some attempts to see whether, so one test to actually test this would be that one would see if a character that helps in one situation would be more likely to share in another or be more positive in another case. And even if I don't reconcile who conducted these works, maybe she or he is in the audience, then please speak up. I think the attempt that I have seen that there may be something like a more general evaluation that that generalizes across domains did not really reveal this, but I'm not sure if there is a lot of work about it, and yeah, have a vague memory that I saw some work about it, and this was not the case.
Does anyone wants to add a quick comment to that? We have Denis saying Surian. You have an answer in the chat from Denis. Meanwhile, we can have Yuri who asks his question, and I'm unmuting you, Yuri.
Thank you. So before I ask my question, I would have maybe I don't know if I can help you recall who is sharing evidence. So maybe it's a different sharing evidence, but Lisa Vorobyova in our center together with Erno Teglas and myself. She has been studying cooperative chasing versus competitive chasing, where two agents are chasing one object. And there is, and it has been on posters, it hasn't been published yet, but we have repeatedly managed to find that cooperative chasing induces an expectation of sharing the prey, basically, while competitive chasing, in the test, one of them always catches the prey first, and it either eats it up by the time the other gets there, or it waits until the other gets there, and then they eat it up together. And we found that indeed, if cooperative goal-directed behavior, so shared goal involving cooperative goal pursuit, induces the expectation of waiting and sharing, while competitive one, when each of them wants to get the same single object, so sometimes they push away the other one, then whoever gets it, it eats it up. And that's what the baby expects. And there is no basic, so just because without this kind of familiarization of chasing, there is no baseline preference for sharing or non-sharing. I don't know whether that was, and this is also kind of, I suppose, speaks a little bit or raises questions about domain specificity. But my real question, if I may, was that I wanted originally, it is a kind of clarification question, and that's for Lindsey. And I have two difficulties with understanding the approach, especially if you say you're looking for minimal building block with affiliation. You also said an innate building block, which is, you know, I like that term, so I have no problem with that, thinking like that. But in fact, I was surprised. I mean, I have a little bit more problem. 1 minute. Okay. So if affiliation is a social term, and it's very, you know, like difficult to define in my way, probability of agent B adopting the other's goal, that can be if I see that the other is chasing something and I kind of adopt that goal and I also chase, then I have a competitive situation. If I am learning from the other, then I don't necessarily have a social situation. I can individual observational third person learning. if I have a teaching, if the other knows or shows, then I have a social learning situation. And in the last 10 seconds that I have, I just wanted to ask a question that you have been co-author with Liz Perky and have subscribed to this idea of a core domain of social being. And you have ran studies showing that before language, that domain is separate and doesn't talk to instrumental goal-directed actions. So it is really imitation and co-movement and alignment and stuff like that. But before you integrate these two, the radical idea, I would say, is that social beings and rational agency are two different domains. And so if your building block starts out with goal-directedness, then how will you build the social being domain?
Thanks for those questions. Is it okay, Olivier, if I go ahead and answer? I'll try to be brief so we have time for other topics too. I'm going to actually answer the second part first, which is about, do I subscribe to a view where there are initially two separate domains of social beings versus agents, which is, it's true that I have co-authored things with Liz, and that is a view that she holds, but I don't think that anything we've written is strongly committed to that view, because although I think there are many things she's right about, that's not one I think she's right about. So I think pretty clearly the thing I'm proposing here is that the way that we understand the social world is built directly on top of the way that we understand individual agents. And that what makes this account social is that it's about the interaction of two agents, and thus it involves agent-agent interaction. But I don't think there's a separate sort of domain of social beings that operate according to principles that are unrelated to the principles of agentic reasoning. So Liz would hold that view. At least the last time I talked to her about it, she held that view. I don't know if she's changed her mind since then. And then there's this question about competition, right? And I think this is a great question. And I think it's one that, so I didn't get into sort of the details of the formal account of sort of reward adoption that, Tomer and Kiley and others have worked with. But I think if you do get into those details, there's ways to distinguish cases where you adopt someone else's goals in the sense that you want them to achieve those goals, either with you in a cooperative sense or just on their own in sort of a helping altruistic sense, versus you adopt those goals to achieve for yourself, right? Which is the competition case. Those things can be made separate in that framework. And in fact, I think that imitation can actually, has a very bimodal valence, right? So in the cases that I've studied in infants, especially when there's a lot of cues of, okay, we're having this pleasant social interaction, we're both participating in it, no one's being threatening or malevolent. There's this sense of, okay, well, we're sharing these goals, but you could construct cases that look a lot more like we're competing over a zero-sum case of these goals. And in fact, I'm collaborating now with Adina Schachner and her postdoc, Madison Pisowski, on exactly this question of if goal sharing necessarily becomes competitive because there's a limited zero-sum resource that there's not enough of for everyone, does the evaluation of imitation flip to being in fact intensely negative? And my favorite, I'll just point out one last thing to sort of maybe bolster the idea that infants or toddlers are ready to make these sort of bimodal evaluations. My favorite detail from a paper is from one of Melinda Carpenter's papers on toddlers' preferences for people who imitated them. And she found that for 18-month-olds who completed her study, toddlers were more likely to help someone who'd imitated them than someone who just had played near them. But there were a bunch of kids that needed to be excluded from the study for freaking out during the part of the study where the experimenter was either imitating or not. And almost every single one of those kids who were excluded came from the imitation condition. So there was this subset of kids who had this really negative reaction to being imitated by the experimenter, which suggests that if you don't have all the right social cues, you can in fact get this sort of impression of this person has the same goals as me and that's bad and competitive, rather than it being this case of this person has the same goals as me and that's helpful and cooperative. So I completely agree with you that competition has that same feature to it, but it's just about the sort of what exactly is the structure of the goal sharing, and does it involve the person who's doing the adoption still wanting the utility to fall to the original actor as well.
I see we have a question from Laura. Laura, if your question is really quick, please go ahead. Otherwise, we can keep it for the last part, the general discussion.
Yeah, let's keep it for the last part then.
Okay. So let's move to our third topic of discussion. And I think the panel we're here was very representative of the field, in that we have been discussing very complex abilities, very early developing complex abilities in infants. But what we lack evidence for in the field is evidence about the limits of infants' competencies, and think about, for example, what we could learn about the systematic limits of infants' object or number cognition as a way to better understand the basic human conceptual apparatus that humans are starting with. So there is a question about the limit of infants' capacities to conceive of affiliation and social relations in general, and more generally, a question about how and when you would expect infants to differ systematically from adults in their representations of affiliation and groups, and how you would expect their representations and preference to be influenced by learning opportunities or the environment they grow up in. I'm sure Moritz has lots of things to say about this, so maybe he could start.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is, from my point of view, mainly a methodological question. But before I tap into this, I think what is crucial is that we as humans, and just to reiterate this point from my introduction, grow up in highly flexible life worlds, and it's really a critical aspect that we have to have in mind when you study infant cognition, that other than many other species, our life worlds, social life worlds, and physical life worlds are so much more diverse. And this may be the basis for, okay, we have to agree on some rules and norms, and just to make others' behaviors understandable and be understandable for others, such that we also may have quite interesting norms which may not seem to make sense, but which are just an agreement in this context to make others more predictable and be more predictable to others. But this, what I want to say with this is that I think this flexibility brings with it a huge demand for learning, but also the necessity to learn structures in the environment from early on. This is a theoretical consideration. On the other hand side, I think it's pretty hard with the methodology, with the methodologies we have, to really say what is there from the start. So even if we look at infant cognition at 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, we have to assume that a lot of learning has already occurred. That's my perspective before that. So I think that with just studying infant cognition, we are not getting to the point where we can really say, okay, that's fully innate. So approaches that could help us there are, of course, those which to really look what is there in just shortly after birth, like a conspec that then somehow is a bias for then learning a face structure, or as we've heard in the first plenary, tendency to attend to biological motion. So really study this very early foundations, or go in a bit more into genetics. But I know that that there the relations are really, really hard to make. So I'm not sure if this can, to which degree this can really give us definite answers. To what degree certain traits are innate or learned. So I think there we are as a field. We have to accept that we have some methodological limitations to really disentangle the origins of cognition there. And yeah, I just pointed out some methodological or some works where I think we can have a first intuition, like having a bias to attend to biological motions or phases, and that on this builds a very highly flexible learning capacity to adapt to highly versatile environments. But that's my stance. I'm interested to hear what you think about it.
So, just a comment, but it's a bit, I mean, there is a big stretch from simple biases to the kind of very, very elaborate cognitive capacities that you and Kiley and Lindsey and Jesús are evidencing in young infants. So it's, then there is a question about the kind of learning story you would build. Does anyone in the panel wants to react or complement what Moritz said about the role of learning, or perhaps the question of the gaps that may exist in infants' representations? Or if otherwise, I should point out that we have 4 minutes left, so we can also open the floor for general questions. If you'd rather do that. So then we have a question from Laura Schlingloff, and then we will have a question by Anna Strasser. I believe, Laura, you are a host. Yes.
Yes, I can unmute myself. I was just wondering how you think what prompts infants to understand, to interpret something that is happening in their environment as a social interaction in the first place, because there's lots of times when people are doing things that are somehow you know, in the same setting, but that are not necessarily, that don't necessarily have this kind of mutual coordination or the impact of one agent's behavior on the other agent's utility function, or whatever that you were referring to before. So I was just wondering if you have any ideas on what's going on there. Is that just a kind of default mode, or are there particular cues for the different kinds of interactions that there are that kind of prompt such an interpretation?
That's a great question, Laura. Lindsey, you unmuted at the same time. I mean, I don't think we know. I think one potentially sort of obvious cue might be just sort of the contingency of two different agents' actions on each other. We know that contingency is an important cue to sort of identification of agents. And so infants can detect contingency with their own actions, but also contingency across, you know, a fluffy blob's actions with an experimenter. And that sort of shifts their interpretation of the fluffy blob to an agent. So I hypothesize, but have no sort of empirical basis for doing so, that contingency between two individuals' actions, whether that contingency is sort of positive or negative, might be a good cue for infants that an interaction is going on.
Yeah, agreed. And also, you know, if we're incorporating sort of basic understanding of agency into social interaction, there's also just like, you know, the basics of gaze, like, right, does someone have an unobstructed view, and are they attending to their social partner? There might also be an important role of emotion, right? So people have started to look a lot at emotion in terms of how agents react to the outcomes of their instrumental actions. But I think there's this open question of how we integrate emotion into thinking about social interactions between individuals, or even signaling that there is a social interaction going on when there's no other explanation for why you might be expressing an emotion in the presence of another person.
Okay, we have time for one last question by Anna. And so I will unmute you, Anna.
Thank you. So this is a very general question. So I'm a philosopher, and I have the very naive question. What is your general strategy to decide whether a finding of a competence in an infant is a competence with comprehension or a competence without comprehension. So how do you make this distinction? So this is influenced by Daniel Dennett's slogan, competence with or competence without comprehension.
Can you unpack this a little bit, because not all.
So if you see any infant having a certain ability or competence, you don't see what they really understand or think or have cognitive abilities in addition. And so my question is, how do you differ in your experimental settings the pure competence, which you can see on the behavioral level, and the thing what is sort of hidden, what is the accompanying comprehension of the whole ability? And of course, you can have competence without comprehension, and that's very convincing and it's working effectively. Was that understandable?
Do you mean in a sort of implicit, explicit type sense, or I mean, in general, in infant studies, we would just design distinct conditions that shift on a particular sort of potentially subtle distinction where, you know, if their comprehension is like this, they should respond similarly in both conditions, but if their comprehension is like that, they should distinguish the condition. So that's the general strategy. But maybe you mean something more like implicit, explicit competence, or?
So what made me think about this question is, for example, the whole debate about mind reading, whether it's mind reading or behavior reading. And you have the same competence on the table. So you cannot make the difference just looking at the behavior. And right, you have to add certain assumptions. And I would be curious, how do you do this with infants being 8 months, 12 months, 18 months?
If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free. I would just say that we do our best to design conditions that hinge on a distinction between, say, a mind reading and a behavioral reading account. And that's really the only way that we currently know how to do so. And you know, I'd be happy to share papers with you that I think by other people, not me, that do a good job of this. But yeah, that's the general strategy for sure.
Yes, I agree. There is probably no general answer to this question. It will boil down to the specific question and the specific experimental design. But I hope we can we can tease apart these two possibilities. I think we should basically stop here. It was a very exciting discussion session. So on my side, let me thank all the panelists. We did a fantastic job, and in particular Lindsey for putting together this session. And maybe I will leave the floor to her to just conclude.
Oh, sure. I wasn't expecting that. Well, thank you, Olivier, so much for that expert moderation. I also want to give a lot of the credit for the origins of this discussion panel to Moritz, who put together an ICAS symposium that was not accepted, that brought us all together in the first place, and brought all these shared issues of interest to the fore. So he gets a lot of credit here too. And thanks again to Laura and Petya for organizing this conference and inviting us to speak. It was so much fun. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience for listening to what we had to say and asking great questions.
So are we staying on for the social program? What is happening now, Laura? Or Petya?
Yeah, very good question. Well, as I said before, the first part of the social program will be the video tour through the CU Baby Lab, and which is about 15 minutes. And after that, we're gonna do what we've been doing on the rest of the evenings too, which is kind of find ways to socialize informally here on video chat by Kiley. And you can either then stay on the Zoom even longer, or you can go into any of the Slack channels and start a video call there, for example, coffee table, or start a new one. You can even go on a call in the channel that goes with your symposium if anyone wants to keep this discussion going. So, but first of all, the video tour. And this was an idea because, as I said before, normally this is offered to BCCCD participants who want to visit the lab. This is obviously not possible this time, so I went into the lab with a camera this afternoon, and I will share this with you now. And I apologize that it's going to be incredibly awkward. Please forgive me. I'm having some technical problems. Give me a second.